December 7, 1941. A date that would forever be etched into the collective memory of the American people. But what many don't realize is that this day, while catastrophic in its immediate impact, also contained the seeds of Japan's ultimate defeat, not in what was destroyed, but in what was left standing. This is the story of how Japanese military leaders came to understand, sometimes too late, sometimes in bitter retrospect, that they had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of their adversary. The early morning hours over Pearl Harbor saw waves of Japanese aircraft descending from carriers positioned 200 miles north of Oahu. 353 aircraft in two waves, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters. Their targets were meticulously planned. Battleship Row, where 8 American battleships sat moored in pairs. The airfield scattered across the island. The mission seemed simple on paper: cripple the United States Pacific Fleet before it could interfere with Japan's expansion throughout Southeast Asia. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of this audacious strike, was no stranger to America. Unlike many of his colleagues in the Imperial Japanese Navy, Yamamoto had spent considerable time in the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had traveled extensively across the American continent. He had walked through factories in Detroit. He had seen the oil fields. He had witnessed the boundless energy of a nation that seemed to operate on a completely different scale than anything Japan could muster. And this experience had given him a perspective that many of his peers lacked. He understood that Japan was picking a fight with an industrial giant. Before you continue with this story, I want to ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories from history. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this particular chapter of the Pacific War. Yamamoto had famously warned his superiors that if Japan went to war with the United States, he could promise them 6 months, perhaps a year, of victories. After that, he had no confidence in Japan's ability to prevail. The industrial capacity of the United States was, by Japanese calculations made in 1940, approximately 74 times greater than Japan's. The Americans had 500 times more oil. These weren't just numbers on a page. They represented fundamental realities about war-making capability that no amount of fighting spirit or tactical brilliance could overcome in a prolonged conflict. But the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had committed themselves to a path of expansion. The conquests in China, though costly and grinding, had convinced many that Japan's military prowess could overcome material disadvantages. The success against European colonial forces in Southeast Asia seemed to confirm this belief. And so, despite Yamamoto's warnings, despite his intimate knowledge of American capacity, Japan rolled the dice on Pearl Harbor. The plan was to deliver such a devastating blow that the United States would be forced to negotiate, to accept Japan's sphere of influence in Asia, to avoid a long war that Yamamoto knew Japan could not win. The attack itself was executed with remarkable precision. The first wave struck at 7:55 in the morning, torpedoes specially modified with additional fins to prevent them from diving too deep in Pearl Harbor's shallow 45-foot waters. Armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells. The Japanese pilots found their targets exactly where intelligence had reported they would be. The USS Arizona took a bomb that penetrated its deck and detonated in the forward magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship's back broke. 1,177 men were lost in moments. The USS Oklahoma took multiple torpedo hits on its port side and capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside its hull. The devastation was real and terrible. By the time the second wave departed at approximately 9:45 in the morning, the tactical results seemed overwhelming. 5 battleships sunk or sinking, 3 more damaged. Numerous smaller vessels hit. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans deceased. From the Japanese perspective, Watching their planes return to the carriers, the operation appeared to be a stunning success. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, made the decision to withdraw. His aircraft had achieved surprise. They had struck their primary targets. He had his orders to then support operations in Southeast Asia. The risk of staying in the area, searching for American carriers that weren't in port, seemed too great. But here, in the decision to withdraw after 2 waves, in the choice of targets that had been struck and those that had been left alone, lay the crucial miscalculation that would haunt Japanese military planners for the remainder of the war. Let me paint a picture of what the Japanese pilots had not destroyed that December morning. Standing intact, virtually untouched, were Pearl Harbor's massive oil storage facilities. Over 4.5 million gallons of fuel oil. These weren't just large tanks sitting on the shore. They represented the logistical backbone of the Pacific Fleet's ability to operate. Without them, every ship would need to steam back to the United States mainland for refueling. The operational radius of the Pacific Fleet would have been effectively cut in half or more. Months, perhaps more than a year, would have been required to rebuild that fuel capacity in Hawaii. Similarly untouched were the submarine base facilities, the maintenance shops that kept America's undersea fleet operational, the torpedo storage and handling facilities. The United States submarine force would go on to wage one of the most devastating campaigns against Japanese shipping in the history of naval warfare. Those submarines operating from Pearl Harbor would sink over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. They would strangle Japan's ability to move resources from its conquered territories back to the home islands. They would turn the vast Pacific into a graveyard for Japanese commerce, and the base from which they would operate throughout the war sat completely unscathed. But perhaps most critically, the repair facilities at Pearl Harbor survived. The massive dry docks, the machine shops equipped with lathes and presses, and every tool necessary to fabricate parts, to weld steel, to repair damage. The cranes capable of lifting 16-inch guns as if they were toys. The skilled workforce of naval shipyard workers and engineers. All of it remained functional. This oversight would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes of the Pacific War. Within hours of the attack, even as fires still burned and rescue efforts continued, Captain Homer Wallen was already beginning to assess the salvage possibilities. Wallen had been on the battle force staff. He understood these ships intimately, and as he surveyed the devastation, he began to see something that perhaps the Japanese pilots, watching from above, had not fully appreciated. The shallow depth of Pearl Harbor meant that while ships had sunk, they had not sunk far. Many vessels that appeared to be total losses were actually resting on the bottom, with portions of their superstructure still above water. This wasn't the deep ocean where a sunk ship was gone forever. This was a salvage operation that, with the right resources and expertise, might be possible. The Pennsylvania Admiral Husband Kimmel's flagship had been in dry dock during the attack. It had taken only superficial damage. The Tennessee and Maryland had been moored inboard of other vessels and thus partially shielded from torpedo attacks. Even the Nevada, which had tried to escape the harbor during the attack and had been deliberately run aground to prevent it from blocking the channel, was in relatively shallow water. Wallen was appointed to lead the salvage division in early January 1942. What followed was one of the most remarkable engineering and salvage efforts in naval history. Navy divers and civilian contractors worked in conditions that were often horrific. They spent over 20,000 hours underwater, made around 5,000 dives. Most of the time, they had to wear gas masks because the oil-fouled interiors of the ships were filled with toxic fumes. They were recovering human remains along with documents and ammunition. They were sealing holes in hulls. They were pumping out compartments. They were doing the painstaking work of bringing these massive ships back from what appeared to be destruction. The speed at which this happened would have shocked Japanese military planners had they fully understood it at the time. By February 1942, just 3 months after the attack, the Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee were back in service or on their way to mainland shipyards for final repairs. The cruisers Honolulu, Helena, and Raleigh, the destroyers Helm and Shaw, the repair ship Vestal. All of them returned to the fight. The Nevada, despite the severity of its damage, was refloated in February. It would eventually participate in the Normandy invasion, shelling German positions behind the beaches. The California was refloated in March, the West Virginia in June. These weren't just being raised and scrapped. They were being restored to combat capability. They would see action again. Of the 8 battleships that had been present at Pearl Harbor, only the Arizona and Oklahoma would never return to service. And even the Oklahoma was righted and refloated, though it was determined to be too damaged for restoration. The Utah, a target ship that had also been sunk, remained on the bottom. But 6 out of 8 battleships ultimately returned to the fight. This recovery rate was extraordinary by any measure. Now contrast this with what the Japanese had expected. Their planning had assumed that the American battleship force would be out of action for an extended period, that the psychological blow combined with material losses would force the United States into a defensive posture, that Japan would have the free hand it needed to consolidate its position in Southeast Asia, to create a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for the Americans to breach. Instead, by mid-1942, the Pacific Fleet was already striking back. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April, the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, and then in June, the pivotal Battle of Midway, where American carrier-based aircraft sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the very same carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The Japanese leadership had gambled that America's will to fight could be broken with a sudden, devastating blow. What they discovered instead was that they had awakened a nation with essentially unlimited industrial capacity and an unshakable determination to achieve complete victory. During the war years, the true scale of American industrial mobilization became apparent. The United States didn't just repair the ships damaged at Pearl Harbor, it built entirely new fleets. Essex-class aircraft carriers rolled out of shipyards at a pace that seemed almost impossible. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers, 17, each one larger and more capable than the Japanese carriers they faced. In addition to those, there were dozens of smaller escort carriers, light carriers. The production was relentless. It wasn't just carriers. Destroyers, submarines, cruisers, battleships, landing craft, transport vessels. American shipyards operated around the clock. The wartime shipbuilding program drew on expertise and techniques that had been developed during World War I and refined in the interwar years. Welded construction instead of riveted. Prefabricated sections that could be assembled rapidly. Assembly line techniques applied to ship construction. Henry Kaiser's shipyards could complete a Liberty ship cargo vessel in an average of 42 days. In one publicity effort, they built one in just 4 days and 15.5 hours from keel laying to launch. This wasn't just about ships. American industry produced aircraft at rates that dwarfed Japanese production. Tanks, trucks, small arms, ammunition, petroleum products, food, medical supplies. The United States was supplying not just its own military, but also significant portions of the British, Soviet, and Chinese war efforts through Lend-Lease. The country that had been mired in the Depression just a few years earlier had transformed itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Japanese commanders operating in the Pacific began to realize the magnitude of what they faced. American task forces that were destroyed or damaged in 1 month would reappear, fully replenished within weeks. Japanese losses, by contrast, were increasingly impossible to replace. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and many of its most experienced pilots. These could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate of loss. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, saw hundreds of Japanese aircraft shot down. Japan's industrial base simply could not produce enough replacements. More critically, they couldn't replace the experienced pilots. The Americans, with their vast training infrastructure, were producing new pilots by the thousands. By late 1944, the strategic situation for Japan was hopeless. American submarines had devastated the merchant fleet. Resources from Southeast Asia couldn't reach the home islands in sufficient quantity. The industrial output that Japan desperately needed was strangled by the American submarine campaign. Surface actions had eliminated much of the combined fleet. American forces were closing in on the home islands themselves. The fall of the Marianas brought the Japanese homeland within range of B-29 Superfortress bombers. It was in this context, in the waning months of the war and in the years immediately following Japan's surrender, that Japanese military officers began to fully confront the reality of what they had faced. Some of this understanding came from captured documents and intelligence. Some came from interactions with American occupation forces, and some came from direct observation. There are accounts of Japanese naval officers visiting American facilities after the war and being absolutely stunned by what they saw. The scale of everything, the industrial infrastructure, the repair facilities that operated with such efficiency. One particular story, though difficult to verify in all its details, has become emblematic of this realization. Japanese admirals visiting American repair docks, perhaps on the West Coast, perhaps at Pearl Harbor itself after the war, walking through facilities that were larger than anything comparable in Japan, seeing the cranes, the machine shops, the supply depots. Understanding that what they had thought was a devastating blow in December 1941 had barely scratched the surface of American capability. Imagine the perspective of a Japanese naval officer who had been part of the planning for Pearl Harbor, someone who had pored over maps and reconnaissance photos, who had calculated tonnages and estimated damage, who had genuinely believed that they were striking a mortal blow, now walking through an American naval yard and seeing ship after ship being serviced, seeing the speed at which repairs were completed, seeing the abundance of materials, the specialized equipment, the trained workforce, the systematic approach to maintenance and repair that allowed the American fleet to operate at a tempo that Japan could never match. The realization must have been profound and deeply humbling, not just that Japan had lost the war, which was obvious by 1945, but understanding why the loss had been inevitable. It wasn't because Japanese sailors were less brave. It wasn't because Japanese tactics were necessarily inferior. It was because they had chosen to fight a war of production against an opponent whose production capacity was so vastly superior that no amount of tactical brilliance or fighting spirit could overcome the disparity. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. His warnings before the war had been prescient, but he had been killed in April 1943 when American fighters, guided by decoded intelligence, ambushed his transport aircraft over Bougainville. He didn't live to see the full extent of the defeat he had predicted, but other Japanese naval officers did. And for them, particularly those who had believed that Japan could prevail through superior will and tactical skill, the confrontation with American industrial reality was a bitter lesson. Consider the story of the Pearl Harbor attack from this perspective. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise. They had executed their plan well. They had sunk or damaged a significant number of American ships. But they had failed to understand the nature of the target. Pearl Harbor wasn't just the ships anchored there that morning. It was the infrastructure, the logistics, the industrial base that could repair those ships and build new ones faster than Japan could sink them. By failing to destroy the repair facilities and fuel storage, The Japanese had left intact the very capabilities that would enable America's rapid recovery. The shallow water of Pearl Harbor, which had required special modifications to Japanese torpedoes, also meant that salvage was possible. The American Navy Yard workers, civilian contractors, and diving teams performed what can only be described as miracles of engineering and determination. They worked in toxic environments, they took risks that claimed lives, they worked around the clock, and they delivered results that confounded Japanese expectations. When the West Virginia, which had been sunk at its mooring with multiple torpedo hits, steamed into Tokyo Bay in September 1945 to witness the Japanese surrender, it was a powerful symbol. This ship had been written off by Japanese planners in December 1941. Yet here it was, fully operational, present at the ceremony that marked Japan's complete defeat. The Japanese naval officers present at that surrender ceremony couldn't have missed the symbolism. What they had destroyed, America had rebuilt. What they had thought was a death blow had been absorbed and overcome. The lesson extended beyond just Pearl Harbor. Throughout the Pacific War, American forces demonstrated an ability to recover from setbacks that Japanese planners consistently underestimated. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, both sides lost a carrier, but the American Lexington was quickly replaced in terms of overall fleet capability, while the Japanese Shokaku took months to repair. After the costly campaigns in the Solomon Islands, American forces were reinforced and strengthened. Japanese forces were depleted and increasingly unable to replace losses. The fundamental asymmetry of the war was industrial. Japan's military had been designed and optimized for relatively short conflicts, decisive battles, quick victories that would force negotiations. The concept of a long war of attrition against an opponent with vastly superior resources was something that Japanese military doctrine hadn't adequately prepared for, even though officers like Yamamoto understood the danger. American military planning, by contrast, had always assumed that the nation's greatest strength lay in its industrial capacity, the ability to outproduce the enemy, to sustain longer supply lines, to replace losses, to innovate and adapt. This wasn't a new insight. It had been a factor in the American Civil War, in World War I, and it was applied with devastating effectiveness in World War II. The Pacific War saw this dynamic play out repeatedly. Japanese forces would achieve tactical victories. They would demonstrate remarkable skill and courage. But the strategic picture continued to deteriorate because the underlying economic and industrial realities could not be overcome. Every ship Japan lost was irreplaceable or took years to replace. Every experienced pilot who perished left a gap that training programs couldn't fill quickly enough. Every ton of merchant shipping sent to the bottom by American submarines reduced the flow of resources that Japan's war machine needed. By 1945, Japan's situation was hopeless. The home islands were under blockade. Cities were being destroyed by incendiary bombing. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August provided a final terrible demonstration of American technological and industrial capability. Japan surrendered in September. The occupation period that followed gave Japanese officers and officials ample opportunity to see American military infrastructure up close. Douglas MacArthur's occupation forces brought with them not just combat troops, but all the logistics and support that enabled American military operations. The contrast with Japan's depleted resources was stark. Japanese industry had been devastated by the war. Shipyards that had built the great battleships like Yamato were damaged or repurposed. The workforce was exhausted and demoralized. Resources were scarce. The economy was in shambles. American forces, by contrast, seemed to have unlimited supplies. Their equipment was well maintained. Their logistics were smooth and professional. They had the resources to not only occupy Japan, but also to begin helping rebuild it. The Marshall Plan in Europe and similar programs in Japan demonstrated American capacity not just to fight wars, but to reconstruct entire nations afterwards. For Japanese naval officers who toured American facilities in this period, the lessons were impossible to ignore. They saw shipyards where multiple vessels could be serviced simultaneously. They saw supply systems that ensured parts and materials were available when needed. They saw training programs that produced skilled workers efficiently. They saw the application of industrial management principles to military logistics. Everything was larger, more efficient, more systematic than comparable Japanese operations had ever been. One of the most poignant realizations must have been understanding how close Pearl Harbor had been to being a truly devastating blow, and how narrowly Japan had missed the opportunity. If the third wave that some Japanese commanders wanted to launch had destroyed the repair facilities and fuel storage, the timeline of the Pacific War might have been different. Not the ultimate outcome, which Yamamoto had correctly predicted would favor the United States in a long war, but the early phase might have given Japan more time to consolidate its conquests, more time to build defenses, more time before the American counteroffensive could gain momentum. But that third wave never launched. Nagumo made the decision to withdraw, and that decision, in retrospect, was the difference between a tactical success and a potentially strategic blow. The repair facilities that remained intact enabled the rapid recovery that followed. The fuel that wasn't destroyed kept the fleet operational. The submarine base that survived launched the campaign that would strangle Japanese shipping. Japanese military analysts studying the war after its conclusion had to grapple with these what-ifs. What if they had targeted differently? What if they had followed up the initial success? But these questions, while intellectually interesting, couldn't change the fundamental realities. Even if Pearl Harbor had been a more complete tactical success, the underlying industrial imbalance remained. The United States would have rebuilt. It would have taken longer, certainly. The war might have lasted another year, or even two. But the outcome would have been the same, because the production capacity that enabled American victory was located in factories and shipyards across the continental United States, far beyond the reach of Japanese military power. This realization, that the war had been unwinnable from the start given the strategic choices Japan made, was a difficult lesson. Japanese military culture placed enormous emphasis on fighting spirit, on tactical excellence, on the warrior ethos. The idea that these qualities, while admirable, were insufficient against an enemy with 10 times or 50 times or 100 times the industrial capacity was hard to accept. But it was the truth that Japanese officers confronted in the years after the war. The visit to American repair docks, whether literally or metaphorically, represented this moment of clarity, seeing the machinery of American industrial power up close, understanding that what Japan had faced wasn't just an enemy military, but an entire economic system geared for war production. Realizing that the confident projections of Japanese planners before the war had been based on fundamental misunderstandings of what they were up against. Yamamoto's prophecy had been accurate. Japan ran wild for 6 months. The initial successes in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, were impressive. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. But then, as Yamamoto had predicted, the tide turned. Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. The long grinding campaigns that followed saw Japanese forces increasingly on the defensive, increasingly unable to replace losses, increasingly aware that they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose resources seemed limitless. The story of Pearl Harbor is often told as a tale of American resilience and determination, of the day of infamy that united the nation and propelled it into war. And that narrative is true and important. But there's another layer to the story It's about the consequences of strategic miscalculation, about failing to understand not just your enemy's current strength, but their potential to mobilize and grow stronger, about the limitations of tactical brilliance when faced with overwhelming industrial and economic superiority. Japanese admirals witnessing American repair docks after the war weren't just seeing shipyards and cranes. They were confronting the reality of why they had lost. They were seeing physical evidence of the industrial gulf that had always existed, but that Japanese planning had underestimated or hoped to overcome through superior tactics and fighting spirit. They were understanding, perhaps fully for the first time, that Admiral Yamamoto had been right all along. The Pacific War had tested whether a nation with enormous industrial capacity but initially limited military force could defeat a nation with a powerful military but limited industrial base in a prolonged conflict. The answer, written in the ships raised from Pearl Harbor, in the fleets built in American shipyards and the overwhelming air power that ultimately devastated Japan's cities, was definitively clear. Industrial capacity, given time to mobilize, would prevail. This lesson has resonated through military history ever since. Modern military planning places enormous emphasis on logistics, on industrial base, on the ability to sustain operations over time. The quick knockout blow remains an attractive strategy, but it's understood to be high risk because if it fails, the advantage often goes to the side that can bring more resources to bear over the long term. For the Japanese admirals who confronted this reality after the war, there must have been a complex mixture of emotions: pride in the courage and skill of Japanese forces, grief for the enormous losses suffered, frustration at strategic decisions that had led to disaster, and perhaps grudging respect for the industrial machine that had ultimately ground down Japanese resistance through sheer material superiority. The ships raised from Pearl Harbor, restored to service, and sent back into action were more than just repaired vessels. They were symbols of American industrial might. Every one of them that returned to combat was a reminder that the attack of December 7th had not achieved its strategic objective, that America had absorbed the blow, recovered, and come back stronger. The Japanese had hoped to cripple the Pacific Fleet. Instead, they had awakened a giant whose industrial capacity would prove unstoppable. Standing in an American naval yard after the war, seeing the scope and scale of the facilities, understanding the systems and processes that enabled such rapid and effective repair work, the Japanese admirals faced an uncomfortable truth. They had fought bravely. Their sailors and pilots had demonstrated remarkable skill and courage, but they had been on the wrong side of an industrial equation that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome. The war had been lost not necessarily in any single battle, though defeats like Midway were certainly turning points, but in the factories and shipyards and training facilities that produced an endless stream of ships, planes, and trained personnel that Japan simply could not match. This is the deeper story of Pearl Harbor, not just what happened on December 7, 1941, but what didn't happen. The repair facilities that survived, the fuel that remained, the infrastructure that enabled recovery. These things, left intact by Japanese attack planning, made possible the American resurgence that followed. And when Japanese military officers later saw firsthand the scale of American industrial capability, they understood finally and completely why the war had ended as it did. They had attacked the ships but missed the real source of American naval power, the industrial base that could build ships faster than Japan could sink them, repair damage faster than Japan could inflict it, and sustain operations at a tempo and scale that Japan could never hope to match. If you found this story fascinating, please share it with others who appreciate military history. Leave a comment telling me what aspect of the Pacific War you'd like to hear about next. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future stories. This has been a deep dive into one of World War II's most pivotal moments and its long-lasting implications. Until next time, remember that history is often shaped not by single dramatic events, but by the industrial and economic realities that determine what nations can sustain over time. The Japanese admirals learned this lesson the hard way, and it's a lesson that remains relevant today.